My name is Sarah Sutton, and I am a painter. I grew up in northeastern Pennsylvania in the anthracite coal mining region in a little town called Kingston. The town itself rested over flooded mines that had been flooded during the Knox mining disaster of 1959. I then moved to northeastern Ohio, about 10 miles from the Perry nuclear power plant, with my dad having an upholstery shop about a mile from the plant. So those realities of this kind of big environmental threat mixed with everyday stories of my childhood. My father was a preacher, so I heard a lot about people's hard lives, and my own family was immigrants from Eastern Europe that came here to be coal miners. So this confluence of realities had a big impact of both the thematics of my work, but also visually, the monumental, huge structure of the cooling towers of the power plant, which were just kind of overtook the landscape wherever I went, as well as the coal breakers that I grew up seeing that lined the valley that I lived in, piles of coal that were still there at that time in the 80s. So those visual landscapes and those complicated relationships to industry had a big impact on my work. I taught for several years, and during that time I learned an immeasurable amount of things. Just recently, I remembered that my own current work, the work I've been making for the past 7 to 10 years, grew out of a two-dimensional design project that I gave. And I only gave it one semester, and students did not like this project. And it was called Information Overload, and they were given, say, 20, I believe it was 20 to 30 images. They were in grayscale, and they had to create hierarchy in some kind of amalgam of those images without reducing them. So it was torturous for the students, and it's torturous for me, but that definitely had a huge impact on my work, and I only gave that assignment one time. It adapted into more user-friendly assignments after that. But that's just one example, a huge example of how teaching impacted my practice. I think of my work as database narratives. It starts as kind of a data dump where I'll collect multiple genres of images on a topic. Those often span framework and time frame. And I'll basically create a collection of images. Usually the topics center on a place, almost always a place. I think my work has its origins in landscape. And that place for me often raises questions, specifically about land use and climate change. I usually have some kind of personal connection to that place. So once I have these multiple images, often contradictory, sometimes personal, sometimes historical, then I will start combining them. And the combining of them happens in various ways, but I'm really interested in compressing these databases of images that we're not used to seeing together in the same frame. And at that point that I start combining them, I really don't have an intention except for an interest or a question about the topic or the complexity of a situation. And then I let the layering process inform the narrative. So it kind of very loosely starts to develop. And in order to make that image decipherable, much like that 2D design project, I have to start abstracting the image. I let the patterns kind of play. They no longer make sense, but I'll have a cylindrical form that is one shape in one part of the painting and it's repeated as another shape somewhere else. So there's a lot of shape shifting and a lot of abstract thinking in terms of form. When I get to that image that's powerful, that starts to really kind of speak to me, I let that guide a very loose narrative. And for me, that's where it's kind of magical, where I've created this scramble of everyday things and images, and I'm looking for something new. So the process of combining or compressing in my work is integral, and it isn't just one process. I have multiple things I do, and I'm always trying new things in terms of how to get all of this disparate imagery together. So if you think about, an image search, it's unified by the size of the thumbnails and the kind of uniformity of the grid. But in my case, I'm trying to unify these kind of databases of topics that are often like very seemingly unrelated. So some of the things I use, I have a model stand that I think of almost like an analog Photoshop. It's got transparent layers of plexiglass, and they're suspended. So I'll put images and cutouts and actual architectural models and ephemera on there, and then use photography to create images from the top. And that will kind of go into a folder, or I'll use some of those selectively. I also use Photoshop, so I'll often just kind of automate a task, like have a batch of images where I delete a certain value, and it kind of creates holes in disparate images in a similar way. That's just an example of one thing I might do in Photoshop. Another technique I've been playing with is using AI. I use my same image folders that I use, in other processes I use. I upload them to the program, and it's an AI training program. So it's looking at all of my images and trying to connect them. So I'll usually have, say 100 images for each painting, dump it into the AI program, and it's trying to understand why those images are together. And it tries to generate a final image that is kind of exemplar of the 100, the database of 100. That image in and of itself is never very interesting to me. It's super creepy, but it's generally just uncanny but uninteresting as well. But the animations that happen from the AI trying to figure out how the individual transitions relate and what's retained in each image is fascinating to me. And I often do use those animations. They're not always interesting. More often than not, they just feed back into the process. So a face might dissolve into a bridge in this transition, and that gives me an idea for a transition in the piece. So those are some processes that I use for that basically compression of these images that aren't really supposed to go together, but I'm forcing them to fit into one frame. So the title of my exhibition is Sticky Mirror, and that is a phrase that comes from Timothy Morton in Hyperobjects, Philosophy and Ecology After the End of the World. And a little bit about hyperobjects first. These are phenomena that are so massive that they're really beyond our ability to comprehend or measure. Things such as climate change, oil, which is such a massive topic. They are phased, they're uneven, so basically their effects are going in one direction somewhere and in another direction somewhere else. They're non-linear, and often hyperobjects stick to us, and this goes back to the title. So they're viscous. We're not separate from them. So despite them being invisible, like radiation, they can affect our bodies, our chemistry, our perception, without our awareness of them. Another example would be forever chemicals. And Slow Violence is another text by Rob Nixon that has had a huge impact on me. And for him, slow violence it's spectacle deficient, so nobody sees it. It happens over generations. It's not recorded, it's not a part of the mainstream narrative. For example, the effects of losing biodiversity or, again, exposure to radiation, these are invisible phenomena. They're latent for long periods of time. So how are these phenomena depicted? I mean, that's definitely it was already a big inspiration for me how to make a picture of something that we don't have a framework for. And my work was definitely taking this on more intuitively after reading these two texts. I definitely feel a connection and more of a context. So, in particular, in that compressing images into the one frame of my work, having 100 images come in to one painting allows the viewer to experience, really complex relationships that I'm sitting in front of the painting. And I think in that way, my work is very much influenced by these two texts. So the scale of my paintings ranges from 6.5 feet wide to 8 inches, so really tiny, even 6 inches. And the reason for that, so that's typically within one show. They're the same series. And I think about paintings as choreographing movement. So I love how the body has to negotiate a viewing distance to the paintings, and often that happens within one painting as well with spatial cues and mark making. I often tweak that as well. So I love seeing people get really close and then move away, especially within one painting. But as they're transversing the space, I love watching, the kind of cadence of how people move around and, what the viewing does to the body. I think it's also a way to keep the viewer active, which is really important to me, that the viewer is doing a lot of work constructing the narratives from the fragments and the patterns, but that also that retina keeps working to focus, adjust. The body has to move and interface. And I think that, that active viewing is so important. I think we're so used to consuming. So I'm very interested in that kind of critical viewing that I work hard to try to create. And I also think in some ways the grayscale addresses that. I think when you're standing in front of one of my paintings, you're kind of enveloped in this world, but it's okay if you walk by. I try to make work that is a relationship, and it's consensual. I think it is possible to just simply walk by the work and just see a big field of gray. I want to make quiet work that packs a punch. I don't want to make work that's aggressive, that forces you to look or be seduced, seduces you to bring you over. I'm definitely more interested in a quiet kind of critical space that is really engaging via the body and the eye. What is the implication of transcending places, time, and linear narrative in my work? Well, for me, it means the constructedness of the narrative is apparent. So there's no fourth wall. The scene is never able to be entered without working for it. There's a lot to connect, and nothing is fixed. There's a structure to it, and there's definitely connections to be made. There's intentionality, but the viewer has to do the work, has to make connections and construct the stories as they view them. And I think about how history spans multiple generations and frameworks. It's active, it's always being constructed and reconstructed. I'm trying to open that up. And with that being said, I want to say that I don't think my work in any way exists outside of time. I think it's absolutely of our time, and I think technology of our time and phenomena, both positive and negative, are what allow me to, or inspire me to construct images in the way that I do. So when I think about collective vision, I think about the dilemma of our evolutionary predispositions in vision. I think having taught 2D design for as many years as I did, it gave me an understanding of what we see and what can happen right before our very eyes without any cognition or any notice of its occurrence. And there's, a lot of phenomena like that where you're focused on one object, and meanwhile, something that has a lot less contrast is traveling through your field of vision and you don't see it at all. So the selective attention, selective vision has served a lot of function throughout history. But current phenomena such as hyperobjects and slow violence and things that are very complex and happen over generations and span time and place, we're not very well equipped to see those things as individuals. But I do think collective vision, ways of combining viewpoints, perspectives, different types of knowledge together into one, I think gives hope that, we can see the world in a different way, that we can see complexity in a way that's truer to reality and less about imposing kind of structures of simplicity and linearity onto reality.